Over the years, I've written a bunch of blogs and I've made quite a few videos on the topic of lenses. I've covered lenses, focal lengths, aperture values, zooms, primes, and a whole lot more. However, I still get questions which ultimately can be summed up as, what lens shall I get? Therefore, in this video, I'm making this one kind of overarching video that covers everything to do with lenses, focal lengths, and answers that question for you. So if you're wondering, I've just got a camera, what lens shall I get? This is the video for you. I aim to be as objective and practical as possible. However, please keep in mind there's always going to be a degree of subjectivity in any of my own opinions because it's based on my experience and my use case. My use case when it comes to photography is street and travel, and I use Fujifilm cameras. However, I will be talking about full frame numbers because there's plenty of other systems out there, so to keep everyone on the same page. Also, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, but more on them later on. The first major decision that you will make is what focal length to pick. Now, an easy answer is, oh, just go get a zoom. That's fine, and I'll talk about zooms in a minute, but you still need to have a good understanding of what focal length to use, and more importantly, which focal length you might use for which scenario. Now, of course, it's not a black and white rule. You can use any focal length for any scenario. It depends on the specific situation, but I'm talking about overall, on average, which focal length should you gravitate to the most, because there's quite a few elements that are going into choosing a focal length that I will cover right now. 24mm and below will give you a very wide angle view, and that can also come with a bunch of distortion and make certain environments look bigger than they are and exaggerate certain parts of the image. So for example, you see landscape photographers shooting with wide angles and they point the cameras down a little bit because that exaggerates the foreground and then the background, and overall it compresses that whole scene into one photo. Whereas if you're standing there looking at the scene with your own eyes, then it's not going to look like that. Equally, architecture uses a lot of wide angle lenses because then you can again compress the entire building into one image. However, you need to be very careful because if you include a lot of people in your photography, or you include a lot of things which are obvious when they're distorted, make sure they're not around the edges because people's faces will get stretched and it becomes a little bit messy. 28mm is still wide, it's immersive, however it doesn't come with the distortion that you get with wide angle lenses, and personally I love that lens as an establishing lens. So if I arrive somewhere and I want to get a nice cityscape, a landscape, I find that lens can still deliver that, but without the distortion and without things looking a little bit strange or unrealistic. I also use a 28 in tight spaces, so markets, tight streets, or anywhere where I don't have much room to move. And in terms of the viewer experience, the viewer will feel like they're on your shoulder, they're there with you, and it's a very immersive image to look at. So especially when you start adding layers and different elements around the frame at 28mm, it creates a very immersive viewing experience. If 28mm was someone sitting on your shoulder, 35mm is more like at an arm's length. Personally, it's my favorite wide focal length, and it's the best for just documenting your day. It's wide enough to give context and to get everything in, or everything that's important in, but it's also tight enough to allow clear focus on what the subject is without having loads of other distractions. That's why pop cameras like the X100 are 35mm. That's why 35mm is very popular with street photographers, because it's a focal length that just allows you to document what's going on. This is the focal length that I personally use if I want to go out with just one body and one lens, and I don't have any specific photography related tasks or things I want to do. I just want to take snapshots of my day out. Maybe I'm with friends, maybe I'm with family, and then have those memories. Also, if I'm going for a general walkabout in a city and I want to focus more on the scene rather than the subjects, then the 35 is the focal length that I would typically go for. If I had to pick a focal length, one focal length for the rest of my life, it would be a 35mm. The 50mm is a classic and is great for photographers that are subject driven. The 35 was about the scene, the 50 is more about the subject. So if the 35 was at an arm's length, the 50 is a few steps ahead. And it allows you to focus on anything that's interesting within the scene. So this is the focal length that I would typically use if I want to focus on street photography, if I want to focus on finding interesting subjects, and get better at street photography as a genre, let's just say that. 50 is also great for portraits, both close-up and environmental, and as a whole, it's a very good focal length to get comfortable with. At one point, the 50 was my favorite. I think it still is, but I am starting to drift more towards the 35 with my current style of photography. But for most photographers, a 50 is essential. As a matter of fact, when people ask me, oh, what kit shall I get? I always say get a zoom and one prime, and that one prime is either a 50 or a 35, depending on whether you're subject or scene driven. Now we're starting to get into telephoto territory, and if the 50 was a few steps ahead, the 85 is across the road. I personally use the 85mm to focus on details, to go for abstract photos, and to start introducing some compression. I also use that focal length if I am shooting subjects, but for whatever reason, I have to keep a distance. Perhaps I'm shooting people at a market across the road. Perhaps I am at a market and rather than going wide, I want to focus on little details within that scene. I find that the 85 can be good in tight environments with a more abstract and detail focused approach. Overall, I don't use it as much as the other two because I prefer a longer focal length if I'm going for details. But generally speaking, this is a good lens to have for abstract and for details. At 135mm and above, we're now firmly in telephoto territory, and aside from the obvious zooming, the biggest difference you will notice is the added compression. So when we were shooting ultra wide, everything looked distorted a little bit, especially around the edges. With compression, everything looks perfectly straight and organized, but it also looks a little bit squished in, and certain things can appear much larger at 200mm, for example, than they are in real life. So some people hate that compression look because within street photography, that could come across as creepy or that you're spying. I think that's personally nonsense. In some scenarios, having a lot of compression can really exaggerate the right parts of the image and give a certain look, not to mention physically be able to reach somewhere. Personally, I love the 135mm focal length because it allows you to get that compression, it allows you to get tight details that you otherwise physically couldn't get, but it's not crazy like 200mm. This is more of a complementary lens that I would use with my 50 or with my 35, and I find that it works especially well for certain travel scenarios. Within a normal street, I generally don't use it. However, whenever I've traveled to places that are a little bit more open, that lens came in very useful. Also, this lens is amazing if you're shooting locations that have long, narrow streets, because that's where the compression effect really comes in. Now, there will be an entire dedicated video to compression, zooming in, and perspective. However, there is a lot of misconception around this. You've probably heard people say, oh, zoom with your feet. The problem is that's not actually very correct, because if you take a photo from this distance, if you zoom in, you will get a different look. If you take a photo and then crop in, you will get a different look. And if you physically come closer without zooming or cropping, you will get a different look. Knowing which look to go for will determine which approach you take. So, as I've said, this will be a whole dedicated video, but don't think that you can zoom in by physically walking closer or by just cropping afterwards. Technically, you are getting closer and you'll get a similar-ish result, but fundamentally there'll be a very big visual difference between zooming in with a lens, cropping in, and physically walking closer to the scene. Now that you have some understanding of focal lengths, let's talk about primes versus zooms. This is a very big topic. Now, straight away to save you time, I'm going to say this. If you're starting out, get one prime and one zoom. When it comes to zooms, get a 24-70 or 28-70, 24-50 or something around that mid-range, because most of your photography will happen between 28 and around 70 mil. And also get a prime. So that prime can be a 35 if you're scene driven, or a 50 if you're subject driven. If you're not sure which one you are, get a 35 because you can always come closer or crop in if you need to. Plus, a 35 is easier to get started with, in my opinion, and a 50 can be more of a specific taste if you're more focused on subjects, but you get the idea. So aside from that, I would say that with a zoom lens, you are getting a bigger, heavier, more expensive package. And with a prime, you're getting usually a cheaper, lighter, and more compact package. Fundamentally though, primes are not different or better than zooms. It's just a different way of shooting. Primes can be quicker because you don't have to zoom in and out. And if you're very comfortable with, let's say, 35 or 50, you already have that image in your head before you've taken a shot, then it can be the difference between you getting the moment or not. So one of the reasons street photographers love primes is because it removes the requirement for zooming in and out. But if you're just starting out and you really have no idea, I would say get a 24-70 and get a 35, because that kit will pretty much serve you for the rest of your life, in my opinion. Regardless of whether you select a prime or a zoom, you will have an option of whether you go for a fast or a slow lens. By that I mean, does the lens open up more and let more light in, or does it not open up as much? So a fast prime will be an f1.2, whereas a slower prime will be around f2. With zooms, a fast zoom is around f2.8, whereas a slower zoom will be around f4. One of them is not inherently better than the other. It depends on your use case, when you shoot, where you shoot, and how you shoot. Just because everyone is shooting at f1.2 at f1.2 doesn't mean that's a good look. Equally, having a slightly slower prime, like an f2 with the Fujifilm lenses, means you're getting a lens that's half the size, half the weight, and sometimes half the cost of the f1.2 version. And when you're shooting during the day, you're most likely shooting at f5.6 or even f8, at which point you can't really tell the difference unless you start pixel peeping. Believe me, I've had f1.2 lenses, f1.4 lenses. Yes, they're usually sharper, they usually have a better image quality if you zoom in, but ultimately if you're shooting during the day and you've stopped down to f5.6, f8, you will not tell the difference unless you start pixel peeping. If you love pixel peeping, if that's your thing, then go for the best, most expensive lenses. But if you actually like photography just as an act of going out, shooting and having some nice images at the end, you'll probably find the f2 lenses or the slightly slower lenses to be more fun because they're lighter, smaller, and less hassle to deal with. Plus you'll have money left over for an actual trip. The final choice is whether to go for a vintage or a modern lens, and by that I mean whether you're going for character or you're going for perfection. So modern lenses tend to be very clean, very sharp, very precise, but they lack character. And people love lenses with character. So if you go, for example, for the old Fuji 35 f1.4, or you can even go before that and look at, I don't know, a Minolta 40mm from like the 70s or 80s. Those lenses have plenty of character. They're not sharp. They have tons of imperfections like aberrations and all that kind of stuff. but when you shoot with them, the images have a certain character and a certain look that you physically can't get with a modern lens. If your plan is to do client work, commercial work, or anything that involves someone paying you to get clean, precise images, or if that's what you like, go for modern lenses. Whereas if you're happy with having slower autofocus or no autofocus at all, perhaps lack of weather sealing, or let's just say a generally older system, but you love character, then looking at character lenses might be more suitable for you. Personally, I have a Minolta 40mm old lens that I use if I want that character, and I have more modern lenses if I need something that's a bit cleaner and a bit more precise. I'd like to take a moment and thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been using Squarespace for over 5 years as my online photography portfolio, where I share my best work from all the trips and shoots. Having an online portfolio is important because it's your little corner of the internet that you can arrange however you like. I would also encourage everyone to start an online blog about their photography. Having a blog is the best way for your website to stay relevant on Google because there's fresh content always being uploaded. Not to mention, it's a great way for your website to become more searchable through SEO. Squarespace offers powerful blogging tools that will allow you to publish blogs from anywhere on any device. Squarespace also offers powerful analytics that help you understand where your readers are coming from and what they're searching for. If you're an aspiring photographer, having your own website is important because it will elevate you from everyone else. For a free trial followed by 10% off your first purchase, please use the link in the description or use code RomanFox when you check out. Thank you for Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching. So to summarize, there's no simple answer to the question of what lens shall I get. It is quite complicated, and I can completely understand those that are starting out can feel overwhelmed. I definitely was. Unfortunately, even with this advice, even if this advice applies to you, there will be an element of trial and error, because you can get a zoom and you can get a 35 prime and you can realize it's not for you, or perhaps you will buy the f2.8, holy trinity set of lenses like I did, and realize that you don't really use them that much because they're so big and bulky and you just don't enjoy that, and you end up going to the cheaper, smaller lenses afterwards. So there will be an element of trial and error, there will be an element of wasted money and time, but that's just part of learning. But I still hope that this video has at least steered you roughly in the right direction. I need to go now because they've started the building work downstairs, and yeah, it's going to get noisy in a minute. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.